Good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to the panel discussion on System Justice Labs with Elena, Robert, Mandy, Kanisa, and myself. And we're quickly going to get going with a brief check-in just to sit in on who we are, who we work with, or how we relate to this process. And finally, what's coming alive for you today. We're all in different parts of the world, but at least 4 of us are on the same continent in the same region. So yeah, just far away. Robin, if you can kick off and pass the baton, and we can get around the introductions, and all of you tuning in can get to know who's on the stage. Thanks so much, Robin.
Sure, thank you, Fergus. Thank you for that, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in. My name is Robin Rankin. I'm from the Tshwane Leadership Foundation in Pretoria Inner City. So for me this week, I'm responsible for communications and design. This week has been enlightening, and there's been a coming alive of the appreciation of the coming together of groups and forming a collective understanding in order to do what we do with a better intention and I think an informed view. And I'm enjoying following the breadcrumbs of this trail, and so happy for this opportunity. Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you. Can you
jump in?
Yeah, Mandy, let's go. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I'm Mandy Rapson. I'm doing my master's full-time through the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, and I'm a scholar of the Bertha Center, and focusing on how small-scale farmers have been adapting in the COVID-19 crisis. What's come alive for me is actually the flies that have suddenly hatched and flying everywhere. So if you see me spotting here and there, you know what's happening in my world.
Fantastic.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll go next. My name is Kanisa Oyowe. I'm also a Bertha scholar in the Systems Justice Network. Systems Justice Lab.
And Kanisa can go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm also a cohort member of the Systems Justice Lab with the Bertha Center and Build Peace Foundation. So what's coming alive for me this week is just the opportunity that COVID has given us, an open window basically to be able to do the work that we do, to be able to do the necessary pivots that we need to make. My special focus is in the public sector. It's an agency on how civil servants recreate, maintain, and disrupt the systems that they're in. So I just feel like, for me in particular, it's a critical time to actually get down and dirty and actually do the work and exploit the window of opportunity that we have, where everyone is basically asking, like, what's new in my sector? What's the new normal for me? And now we have an opportunity to actually partner and co-create what the new normal is. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you, Kanisa.
And
Elena,
I'll just
would
say,
you like to
yeah, I can just say hello. So my name is Elena, and I'm the director and co-founder of Build Up, which is one of the core organizers of the conference, but also one of the, what would I say, co-conspirators of this idea. Of this idea, accomplice. I think accomplice is the right word. Of this idea behind the System Justice Lab, connected to the conference, and also just connected to the idea of a broader conversation with the community of innovators that that Build Peace brings together. And I think what's very alive for me this week is, when we decided to turn this event virtual, I thought, are we going to lose the connection to Cape Town and to South Africa? And I don't think we have, actually. I feel like we're still very connected, and that's been really wonderful. And I'm happy that we will try to do the event physically in Cape Town next year again, and that this will be a continued conversation around the System Justice Lab. But it's just been really great to see how grounded we are still with all of you. So I feel like I'm just along for the ride on this session and to learn, and I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you, Elena. As an accomplice, I think, it's got a lot to do with being along for the ride together. So thank you for that. So Fergus turning here with Bertha Center and more specifically with the Systems Justice team at the Bertha Center, and co-organizing Build Peace this year in a way that I've never co-organized an event. So thank you all. And I very much echo those remarks. So what's coming alive for me is, I guess, just feeling energized. After a full day and really most of the week online and on and off technologies, I suspected that this was going to be tricky to pull through in terms of my own personal energies. But as Elena has pointed out, it has felt connected. It has felt somewhat communal, despite its distance. So that's very good. And just to give a little bit more context to this this session right now on the main stage is a little bit more about what this what Elena and I were co-creating and being accomplices to much earlier in the year, prior to global lockdowns, during Elena's visit to Cape Town in our preparations back in February. And what came up there during a collection of different conversations with prospective participating organizations, partners, and network building here in Cape Town and Joburg was this constant echo of if we're going to contextualize in Cape Town, how can we take this idea of a communion, of a gathering, peace builders, justice workers, to a level where the conference itself is embedded in this Cape Town, in this space, but through a process that begins much earlier in the year. And that's really where the Justice Labs came in. The idea was to put a call out to the organizations that we've met with, as well as our other broader networks, and to invite them into a process that would expand across 12 different weeks, in person, running through a systems mapping exercise, and building into a portfolio of prototypes or possible prototypes that would be sort of explored and nurtured through Build Up's own peace innovation process, which is a more of a design-oriented solution finding side of things. So we were really thinking, well, how can we bring cohorts from these different themes, from surveillance capitalism, open space, identity polarization, organizations, individuals working in this space, together, a learning journey over the course of those 12 weeks, and then they would present and share what they've been able to do at those in-person sessions at the conference. And this was back in February, and the idea was that just prior to the conference with Build Up team in Cape Town, would be Bertha would sort of, to put it this way, kind of pass the baton to Build Up with these cohorts to work their own design process with the peace innovation design process, and even forward past the conference to invite those cohort members to join the peace fellowship, which is something that Build Up, of course, as many of you tuning in right now will know, have done year in and year out. It's one of their core programs in different conflict-affected regions around the world. And so it was about seeing this pilot for a more rooted approach to bringing people into this space. And I do see that one of our members has just lost connection, but I'm sure they'll be back shortly. And with that as a sort of overview framing, before we jump into a little more detail and the sort of meat of the discussion, or should I say the greens of the discussion, just to hand over to Elena and ask if you'd like to just add a little more color and illustration to that context.
I think that's I think that's a good overview, Fergus. Just to let you know, Mandy is just refreshing in order to improve her audio stream, but she's coming right back. There she is. And I think, I don't know, would it be appropriate for me to share a little bit of the background of Build-Up's work in peace innovation? And that's
I think so.
Yeah, if that's what you mean by color. So at Build-Up, one of our biggest program areas is this Peace Innovators program, which we've been running for a number of years in different places. So right now we're running it in Syria, in Yemen, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Niger. And this program, essentially, we only do it if we get invited by an organization that is somehow connected to that context. And then what we do is we work with whoever we're partnering with to identify either individuals or fairly small civil society initiatives of some kind, so activists. So it's not kind of large NGOs typically, but sort of smaller initiatives that are working on what, very broadly we would define as community peace building. So these are all sorts of initiatives that are fostering dialogue or building social cohesion. And we look at the work they're doing with them, and then we have this process of human-centered design that we walk through to try and identify what are the leverage points within that program that could be improved by the introduction of a technology or an innovation. And the conversation that emerged with Fergus, I think, it was, the systems thinking process that the Bertha Center undertakes is a much deeper way of really analyzing what leverage points might be. We're a little bit more superficial about analyzing where leverage points are. And what we go quite deeply into is the process of innovation. That's what we're quite used to working on. And so we just thought, is there an interesting marriage here of these two models and these two ways of working, both of which are very emergent? Like the whole point of the way that we do the innovation process is emergence. And it seems to me that the whole point of the way that the systems thinking process works and the systems justice lab works is also emergence. So that's kind of, I think that would be the color that I would add. So I'm excited because I don't really know the systems justice labs or the systems thinking process, but I'm so excited to see how we can continue it with this very emergent innovation process that we typically do for peace innovators.
Thank you for that. That was precisely the kind of color that I was referring to. Thank you. So to follow on from that, what is a system justice lab? Okay. In a nutshell, it's applying the systems thinking lens, which is as much a toolkit of exercises and activities that can be applied to any change management process or interventional solution finding activity. So as much as it is a way of thinking and an attitude towards process work, towards social work, towards peace building, I guess. And there are a sort of number of things that systems thinking as an approach and as an attitude takes into account. First and foremost, it's about recognizing, as Elena put it, the emergent reality of social process work. Recognizing that we're embedded in a macro system of increasing complexity, to which uncertainty is appreciated and accepted. So any process that might be handled with a systems thinking approach recognizes the overall uncertainty of any design process or any sort of co-sensing or system mapping process. So uncertainty, recognizing the complexity and interconnectedness of the variety of elements that comprise a particular system wherein we may be working and wherein we may be trying to intervene or shift or nudge something. Or in Medesa's words yesterday, heal, to do healing work, however we find ourselves doing that healing work. So applying that systems lens to a learning cohort, a group of people, that's the social lab, with varying perspectives around a particular sector or issue or theme, and exploring that particular system, that particular sector with an experimental sort of mindset point of view. So that's the lab part, right? So we often in social work, in peace building work, in justice work, particularly when it's connected to philanthropy and donor partners, there's a over-reliance on monitoring and planning and certainties around how a process is going to have an effect, what the desired outcome is, and how the implementer, the doer, is going to make that thing happen. And so there's a reticence to experiment. There's a reticence to recognize that, especially in the social fields, in the societies and disconnected spaces that we are trying to mend, trying to heal, experimentalism and a more open, uncertainty, welcoming approach is valuable. And so that's really what the lab is. It's a group of people. At this point, it's 8 individuals who've come together through a process that really is not what we had originally imagined, where it would have been a 12-week in-person set of modules and workshops. But what it has looked like is that we've set off with open dialogue interviews. You heard a bit about dialogue interview process from Lenny Lennox in yesterday's short talk about redefining how we can think about a democracy in a non-linear way. And indeed, dialogue interviews as a way of kicking off a discussion, a research process, a working process, is about non-linear conversation that engages key themes and co-creates the outcome of the interview. The idea of the interview is to build trust, and the idea of the interview is to co-create where it is we want to go to next. So with each cohort member, it set off with a dialogue interview styled engagement, so as to really just settle into, okay, what's coming back to us from the variety of cohort members we've invited. A lot of the groups, the organizations that we started this journey with are not with us any longer. They're no longer part of the 8. And that's for varying reasons, including time commitments and the like. But those dialogue interviews help to also reflexively adjust how we're going to run the System Justice Lab. That led into a set of initial sessions, which were really basically just a little bit more like lectures and presentations on systems thinking, systems toolkits, some of Bertha Center's work and prior research and teaching in this space, and applying that lens to sort of what we're seeing during this year of tumultuous change and crisis, which often reveals systemic properties, systemic dynamics, and the interconnectedness of all things, all sectors or systems that we often silo and think about in their own rational and analytic way. But when things get rough, often that helps us to identify these system properties that we talk about. And so after those initial sessions, we stepped into the beginnings of a systems lab process, applying a systems mapping set of activities to particular questions, line of inquiry that the cohort are jointly interested in. So we could exercise those different systems toolkits and frameworks and attitudes of approach. Once we'd concluded that process, which is shorter, 3-week, then to dig into a longer term systems mapping with each cohort member's own research or working opportunity or challenge. So that's what the process looks like as a whole. I know that feels quite abstract. That's okay, because we're going to jump into giving that also more color, more illustration with our cohort members on the call right now. But just to give you a sense of what it all looks like and what it's looked like thus far. So speaking about the way that pandemic and the variety of second and third order shocks of the global pandemic and lockdown, speaking about how that has been a real sobering, I guess, clarity in terms of the fragility, the fragility of the systems that society, to some extent, takes for granted. So the institutions that hold things in sway, that hold things in the balance, at odds, and the fragility exposed. And in those moments, there's an opportunity for change, for nudging things in slightly different directions, and other times completely revolutionary directions. And we're seeing that around the clock, all over the world. These great big shifts. All of a sudden, institutions are able to move faster. Things are able to change. Language about a particular thing that seemed to be stuck is completely up in the air and open for recreation. From homelessness to healthcare to basic income to different policies around economic development in South Africa. All topics are up for flux and change. And over this time, how can we apply a systems lens and a constructive sensing and mapping exercise, as exemplified by what we're trying to do with this System Justice Lab? How can we apply that to our work so that we can navigate in this storm, in this tumult? So that's the framing of the next section of this panel discussion. And I'm now going to hand over to Robin, Kanyisa, and Mandy with that question in mind. How has your work and research interests and directions been affected by the current circumstances of the day? And with that in mind, if you can shine some light on exactly that, some of the opportunities and challenges, what are you noticing in your fields in the broader social justice space? Yeah, if you could share a little bit about your remarks on that, that would be great. And if I could hand over first to Robin, and then Robin, when sort of, please, everybody else, let's be open to discussion and interjection wherever we feel the insight and eureka moment emerges. But I'll hand over to Robin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My work and research interests are around communication, design, creative expression platforms, and so forth. So before I go into what's been affected, I also want to name the things that have shifted in our context in the inner city of Pretoria, South Africa. So the pandemic really didn't cause as many things as it highlighted for us. It highlighted the homelessness situation. It highlighted the violence, specifically gender-based violence issues, much more. Also within the perimeters of the lockdown rules and so forth, people being huddled into their houses with people that might be abusive and so forth. It highlighted the healthcare shortage. And then also a very big role player is that it highlighted the way NGOs' participation in the city is viewed as well. All of a sudden, NGOs held knowledge and experiences that was needed that wasn't held anywhere else. So what happened then next was everything took a deep dive into the virtual world. So in a sense, this is my world. So I was like, okay, I'll meet you there. But it was a different dynamic. Events, workshops, creative sessions, and all of those things had to be redesigned. And although that we had a wider reach, the ideas we had in the beginning of what we were wanting to do, I mean, probably similar to what you envisioned for this conference in the beginning, it was all of a sudden was something else. And it felt like it was taking on a bit of a shape of its own as well. And there were suddenly other platforms for sharing creative expression as well. So whereas you would normally have a small group and just that group would see what's happening with each other and interact, all of a sudden you have virtual storyboards, you have all of these things, you have inputs coming in. So our social justice campaigns had to be investigated and really come down. It usually, it would be something that you do every year, like same recipe, same everything, but all of a sudden it had to be like really looked into the finer details of what do we want to accomplish and how do we move that online. And then also not to lose its essence or to be set aside because of the pandemic, but to rather be strengthened in that way. Yeah, fundraising had to be done more intensely and creatively. It came down to a new set of skills in that way. And also a high dependency on donor and individual relationships and collaborations. What I say is some of, synonym of 2020. Thank you.
So I think what was fascinating in my space in terms of COVID-19 is, I've got a strong focus on the food value chains, and I was very fortunate that, that was my focus for my master's just before the pandemic. And then with the pandemic, this kind of like beautiful but painful emergence of experience that I got to be a part of presented itself. And I say beautiful but painful because, as we know, it's been an incredibly painful experience for many of us. And with the food value chain, it was this, again, like you said, Robin, it presented things that existed before. The pandemic didn't necessarily cause things, it just brought stuff to surface. And what became glaringly obvious is how flawed the food value chain is. There was a situation around the country where people were struggling for food and nutrition in the very same places where food is produced. And realizing that there's very little link between local food production and local food nutrition, but yet they sit side by side. And the beautiful part of it is I got to see some incredible innovations happen, kind of disaster relief in the beginning, how people started to solve for that, and how they created almost like new value chains that in a time of crisis, you can't lean on what you know because everything is disrupted. And now we're seeing how these disaster responses, this like emergent entrepreneurs, going into a bit of a second wave of their journey, where they're now saying, well, we've emerged. How do we create what we do into something more long-term and sustainable? And then also looking at how the small-scale farmers themselves, what has been the crux that has made them able to endure this pandemic, and hopefully learn from that and be able to replicate that or to scale that in our support. And I speak about our, like, as social innovators and entrepreneurs, and how we can take those learnings and then put them back in, and to use puns of farming, like plow them back in and see what grows. So that's been what's fascinating in amongst this crazy COVID time.
Thank you, Mandy. Okay, so I'll sort of touch on that, what's fascinating. But as well, sometimes I have trouble describing what it is that I do. But because my research interest is around the public sector and around issues of agency among civil servants in the way that they can recreate, maintain, and disrupt their systems. So I just want to start by like illustrating that what we imagine to do as an organization, which is Public Servants Network, is what we call a human blockchain that consists of a network of civil servants, where the interconnecting nodes are like the values and the shared beliefs across all levels of government about what kind of progress we want to see in the public sector. So imagine a peer-to-peer verification, of actions that take place across every level of the system, doing away with the culture of, silence when there's wrongdoing and the command and control that comes from the top. So what we're really trying to push, and also what I'm digging deep into researching about my master's, is how to create a community of people that are coordinated in the agenda to transform the public sector. So it's been a really interesting time in terms of, like, when I first posed my research question last year, like, none of what has happened during COVID time, was happening. Everything was really up in the air, almost like hypothetical. Or it was, me wishing that, maybe things can really change. So I just feel like COVID it's just been such, in as much as terrible things have happened, obviously as a result, there's been a lot of loss of human life, a lot of injustice all around. But yeah, what I just wanted to say is that now with the Systems Justice Lab that we're working on, it's just given me an opportunity to be able to recalibrate my thought processes around that, and to really be able to reaffirm, what's possible, and to actually take the thinking to the people that are actually doing the work in the public sector. And so with that, I think also what's been really interesting, like what Robin was saying, is how things have just happened, how institutions and organizations that were like monolithic and slow moving, e.g. public sector, government institutions, we're now able to build hospitals in the space of 7 days. So now we actually know that things that we thought weren't possible before the pandemic actually are. And it just gives us a lot more momentum to be able to push, towards the things that really need to be done in the sector, and to just be unapologetic really about it. Because there's no way we can wait for people to resign or die before we actually decide to work on the mental models and the attitudes and the beliefs, that are there in the public sector. I mean, there's a lot of brilliant people that are working in the sector, a lot of, pockets of excellence. So I think our real push now is being able to create that community that isn't siloed to local, national, provincial government, for example, where we are all a human blockchain that's, constantly holding each other accountable, verifying actions, convening, talking on the important points, because conversations are the starting point of action. So yeah, I just feel like it's a new confidence that's come with this kind of time that we're in the world. And what else did I want to add? Yeah, I think I don't want to say it's exciting again, but I just think that it's a real opportunity that we can all make work for the better.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to drill down a little further on this this application of a learning process, these labs, on the perspectives of cohort members' work and research area, as Kanisa has described. So I want to sort of drill down a little more deeper into asking you, how does this lens and the toolkits, activities, and attitudinal shifts in thinking, how does this lens and this learning space specifically influence or affect the way that insights are surfaced in your work? And if you could give us a little bit of a sense of what that might mean in terms of using that word, calibrating and integrating it with your own organization's process or purpose, or in the case of Mandy, that your research is entwined with a sector. So of course we're at a nascent stage of this System Justice Lab, and it's too early to talk about examples of actual integrations with broad teams, but that's where we want to go. And so that's my question to you. How might this lens, this learning space, these labs, integrate with your sector or your organization? And what do you imagine that looking like in the near future? It's all to play for. Open discussion. Robin, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
No,
the things that have been standing out to me is really an opportunity to revolutionize and to reframe. It's almost reassessing resources and collaboration, and also, very importantly, reshaping models that do no longer serve us. Doing that introspection of how do we perpetuate norms, that do not contribute, and what is outdated to our purpose?
Sure.
Mm.
I'd like to latch on to what Robin was saying there as well. In terms of using systems language, which is the language of transformation, or it's generative. So it's about applying that language to the problems, to the opportunities, to the current crisis, and to be able to reframe as well on my side, you know, how we see things going forward. The whole notion of we can't rebuild or recreate institutions with the same language that we destroyed them with, kind of thing. So if you're an institutional entrepreneur, then it's really important to be able to focus on the language that you're using to rebuild in order to achieve different results. And so my focus is mainly on the mental models, which is what's happening really under the iceberg and not necessarily on the main events of what's happening in the public sector. And so for me, the program has been really interesting in that regard, in the sense that it gave me a sense of being able to measure twice and cut once, in as much as it's not an exact science, but being able to look at mental models while building our very young organization. That, like, what is the foundation of, you know, the beliefs, the norms, you know, the principles, you know, in what we're doing, and how do we communicate that with our partners, our stakeholders, potential donors, and the public servants and civil servants that we are giving an invitation to join us in the work of transforming the public sector. So for me, it was really generative in that sense, that, okay, now I actually have a language to be able to express what is it that we're doing, what is it that we are reimagining. And it's not just a matter of jargon necessarily, but it's just a new way really of thinking and conceptualizing, which I find useful for anyone in any sector. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in next. I mean, there's an African proverb that says something like, you can't imagine the oceans until you're brave enough to leave the shores. And the reason why that strikes me is because what the Systems Lab has been very interesting to experience, and has been like going to the wild side, but at the same time grounded in logic. It's design thinking, it's innovation, it's unlearning, while systemic and systematic. I mean, I use those two words because they're very different, but, you know, sounding very similar, but just with a deep sense of logic, looking at, you know, what are the systems that reinforce themselves negatively, and then breaking it apart, which is the kind of the design thinking part of it. And then how can we build that together in a way that is systematic and logical, but allows for open collaboration in its restructuring. And with, you know, COVID-19, that's something that has stood out. So I've been able to recognize how so much of what we do, even though it feels very abstract, is systemic, regardless of the industry that you're in. And then the unlikely collaborators that have been involved during this time, whether it's civil response, whether it's the small scale farmers, whether it's government, whether, you know, it's private industry kind of input as well. So yeah, it's just given a lens of looking at wicked problems, where they almost seem insurmountable in its whole, but can really be challenged on a granular level, trying to identify where would be a good leverage point to start. And we've had some amazing discussions. Just recently, the last one is, and I think we'll go into it later, so I won't bust that bubble just yet, but just like, all right, we've identified problems, we've identified power struggles. What can we do first and next, and how will that have a great opportunity or great space to have great impact?
Yeah, so Mandy, actually that's just a perfect flow into where we will then drill down a little bit further into the granulars. So recognizing the language, the new mental models, the new way of reframing is not just key to the attitudinal shift, but also key to the variety of activities and exercises that we've currently been working on and will continue to dive into. That way of approaching something that feels so urgent. So a lot of everything that's come up in our discussions, if you think that the kind of problem statements or the kind of research questions that we're all looking at, or our organizational challenges, they feel so urgent. They are so urgent. They are emergent. They are an emergency right now, and at the same time, they require that two-time measuring, one-time cut. Because if we're not prepared to take that pause, I think it was mentioned in one of our last sessions, the sort of, I think it might have been Eleanor, one of our other cohort members from Unyoke Foundation, who sort of messaged right after our session to say, look, we've got to have another call soon with the whole cohort before our next actual workshop to dig more deeply into what we had been discussing around this pause element and what that means in the everyday. What does that mean on Monday morning in her workplace? So this sort of how does one bring different mechanisms to shift the way that we are approaching these kinds of urgent emergencies into our daily work. And that's something that we've been grappling with much more recently. And I think it's led to a lot of very sort of tangible and tactile discussion around we've done the mapping, we've done some mapping processes, and we've kind of honed in on a particular area of focus. And now we're looking at, well, what are the leverage points and what does that look like? What are the mechanisms for shifting and nudging and finding different voices to strengthen? And so with that in mind, I'd like to offer or ask if there's anybody who just wants to express a little more, maybe share now the more granular of one of the system map sort of questions that we've kind of gone down pertaining to philanthropy and donor partnerships. And again, I'd ask if anybody's keen to share that line of inquiry that we've explored, but again, through the lens of where are the opportunities for shifting and making those changes at those leverage points because of pandemic, because of the lockdowns and the associated changes and everything really. And then post that, I'd like to actually dig into some of the mechanisms that we've started to describe and what that might mean for our day-to-day work going forward.
Hey, Fergus,
yes.
Before you do that, I'm going to interject because I'm keeping an eye on our chat. And I think we have, so Sanjay Fernandez, who he's a participant who comes from Colombia and does some really interesting work that I think would actually really speak to a lot of what you're talking about. That's just his background because I happen to know who he is, but he posted a question which I would summarize as, I think that because we're taking them on a walk on the wild side, but perhaps we haven't explained the logic behind it, to borrow Mandy's metaphor. It's a little hard to trace where we're going with this whole process. So he is asking, can you give us specific examples of how you are doing what you're doing in the experiments you're talking about? And my sense is that part of the reply to that is to explain to Sanjay that we're actually not at the experiments yet. We're at the mapping phase, at the research phase, if you want. So that's why Sanjay, that's why Fergus just asked. So there's kind of an exploration of the overall system, and then there's an identification of the particular leverage points in the system. And then eventually, and there are lines of inquiry, which I think the three of you are just going to talk about. And then eventually there may be an experiment in each one of those leverage points, or we might call it an innovation in my language. But we're sort of not at that. Is that a good summary? Sorry to.
That's a great
yes?
summary, and
okay.
It's 100% how I would have responded to it. And at the same time, Sanjay and anyone else listening, what we can maybe do is, Robin, Kanisa, Mandy, if you could describe, like I was saying, if you could describe those different mechanisms that we have been digging into from the perspective of what are we imagining we might be able to shift and nudge. We've already sort of opened this up and we've tried to rein ourselves back, but that would, I think, give a lot more tangibility to what Sanjay is referring to. So just where those nudges might occur in our workspaces. But yeah, I hope that's clear enough.
I'll jump in, and people can add to this because it is a group thing. But yeah, we spoke about the long-standing, almost paternalistic funder or donor-recipient relationships. Especially the bigger the funding it is, the more one finds that they're having to work through metrics and measurements to do their own auditing and sense checking that what they're investing in is ticks all the boxes and works in many ways, and they've probably created their own requirements of what they need with their heading with their strategies overall. But often we find there's a disconnect with even just the language that is used from the recipient side, from the organization side. We spoke about how some funding might be pushing we need to create jobs, but then the organization is setting up entrepreneurs, and something as simple as that, like if they're not technically on the payroll, how do you quantify how many jobs were created? Plus, if you're looking at jobs, you create 100 jobs, sure. You're looking at entrepreneurs, you start with 1,000 and you whittle down to 100. And that's what you're working with, where that could look like you're losing people along the way. So just those complexities around those relationships that came up, and we thought where would be a good place to start. And I mean, you could talk for a long time, but one of the small things that came up in our limited time that we've had together is possibly looking at getting the organization to design the reporting system so that and then obviously there would be a dialogue with the funders so that an agreement that this still achieves the same goals for them, but then you're able to report in a way that makes sense to you. And also organizations, they're very entrepreneurial and take a lot of iterations to kind of tweak the model that's working, but quite often the very institutional donors are needing to see consistency, but on the ground it's changing all the time, and you can't scale a mistake. You need to check things before you scale up, which sometimes slows the process down considerably, where you think something might have taken 18 months and now it's taking 3 years. It's quite hard for a donor to stomach that. So I'd love for other guys to jump in because they're a part of this discussion. But that's one of where we're heading towards more of the tangible. We haven't got to experimental stage yet, but yeah, it's just the starting point.
Yeah, I'll jump in with what Mandy said. Well, in terms of my experience, I'm still at the initial stages of, in terms of the life cycle of my organization. But one thing that was really important is also framing the ethics and framing the North Star of what the work is that we are doing in our organization. And so in the social justice labs, we were basically just discussing the concept of the power dynamics between the funder and the actual organization, and how to actually really level the playing field in terms of that, because you find, especially in my position, where we're a new organization, we're looking for funding, and then there's certain things that donors are looking for. And so there's always the temptation to kind of, yeah, there's a blurry line where this is something that you do, but it's not necessarily the direction you're going in. But because you're looking for funding and you want to be able to make a meaningful impact in a particular area, you end up maybe revising a little bit on what it is that you're doing. And I think it was just addressing also the ethical question of, like, as soon as you do that or deviate from your North Star in a way that isn't necessarily organic and natural, and then you get the funding, you're actually taking funding away from people who would have benefited, or like funding away from people who actually have experience and the expertise to be able to do what you propose to do, like, more efficiently than you. So it was also looking at those dynamics, and also like putting emphasis on like the convening and like the scaling out part, where as organizations who are doing change work, that there isn't so much of a disconnect in terms of the conversations that we're having internally, that we need to really be having conversations with each other in order to maintain the power dynamics, so that when we meet with donors, like there's a common consciousness of where we all coming from, that yeah, it's hard to take advantage, or like it's hard to just not be taken seriously when you're sitting there, that all voices matter, and we working towards this, that like everyone sitting at the table actually has a contribution in terms of what kind of work is done, when it's done, and for whom it's done, and that it's not just coming from the party that has the money.
Yeah, I think I want to add on with Kanisa. Martin Luther King framed it in the words of net of mutuality, and I think that is where we're heading. It's challenging the norms that hold us to an almost inhuman accountability. We're looking at something that's more beneficiary-centered than donor-centered. Mandy mentioned the reverse reporting that we were talking about, and I think the emerging themes here, or the opportunities, might be, how do we handle ourselves now that we are in this almost this unbecoming that the pandemic caused? How do we reintroduce ourselves? How do we reshape those models? The language that she mentioned is something that typically will be for proposals. It will be submit, comply, you propose, we select, where I think this is not something that necessarily contributes to the stories that we want to be able to share.
Thank you for that, and I hope that provided a little more pointedness to sort of where we're starting to lead our scanning, our mapping process. I'd like to just quickly provide a tentative response to Sanjay. When we're talking about mapping, we're not talking about, it's more of a plural. So we've got a set of different exercises and ways of mapping what's coming up in our discussions, in our sessions. And actually, a couple of days ago, I'd sort of brought up the question of whether this session could be a workshop or maintain on the panel discussion. And one of the reasons I was recognized there was also going to be value in the workshop format was precisely for this reason, to sort of run through some of these exercises, even if just briefly. So we settled on this format. However, as I've responded, I think direct in the chat, I'd like to suggest that either we throw up a selection of examples onto a booth. Perhaps we could just use the Bertha Center booth, or I'll look into creating a new one. But putting some examples, including some links and some process notes into the booth for you to have a look at, or and this is what I would actually prefer, or adding a Systems Justice Lab workshop session as part of the unconference slot. So those are my suggestions. Yes, Elena.
I think unconference slot, 500%. And also, I think you could post those examples as an announcement feed in the, in the lobby, because I think that way, if others are, didn't make it to the panel, I know we've actually got quite a good audience, but then they'll come on and they'll see it in when they scan that feed. So you just need to contextualize it. So just say for anyone who attended the panel or who missed the panel, here's some of the examples. And also we're going to be having an on-conference session. I think that would be great. I believe you can do that yourself. You can also just send it to me and I'll happily do it. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sanjay, I think you would enjoy this. I've seen your interest in this, and I think it really is a match to what the work you're doing as well. And I saw Chris Langdon also ask for further reading. I feel like this approach, Fergus, is resonating to a lot of people. So. Yeah,
and I think it's useful to also mention, especially for those familiar or familiar with some of the language, it's worth noting a couple things here. The first is, as Madisa mentioned yesterday in our opening remarks, she took the opportunity to sort of mention that sometimes the language gets in the way of what we're really talking about. The other thing that she said is she was reflecting on when Elena was down in Cape Town representing Build Up and the Build Peace community. She was meeting with our systems justice team at Bertha Center, and there was that conversation where Nadisa looked back at Elena and sort of recognized that the work of Build Up is synonymous with how Bertha Center is approaching our own systems executive education coursework, system justice labs in this case, and our work as a center in general. And there was a sort of recognition of, oh, I see, oh, we're just calling it different things, or we're approaching it from different angles. And so to recognize that it's possible for Sanjay, for Chris, for anyone else who's listening, that you're already doing the work from different angles. And what's interesting to note is that the Justice Lab is informed. It's a pilot, and it's very much a co-created pilot, sort of in terms of how we thought it up with Build Up. It's a pilot that tries to bring together and marry a selection of different methodologies and approaches that we feel comfortable with. And so on a meta level, I don't know if anybody is familiar with Theory U, which is a sort of meta process design tool and framework from the Presenting Institute, sort of based out of MIT, that I can't recommend highly enough in terms of a diagnostic, but as well as a way for sort of understanding different ways of designing social process. And again, I'll pop some of these links and some of the really good overviews of that work, either on this channel or later on in our chats. Another sort of methodology that this draws from is social labs, which is really a sort of, could say, a shorthand for a different approach to dealing with complex, interconnected and intractable problems. And so social labs is essentially what I've kind of described here. It's bringing different parts of a particular system together to bear on a complex issue, approaching it from a systemic point of view. That is looking at the underlying causes of phenomena that we experience in the world that we may be trying to challenge and address, and fundamentally being experimental. And so there's all sorts of overlaps, right? There's overlaps, like in principle, with Theory U and social labs and the theory and practice notes on social labs from some of the key, from management consultancies to sort of cultural hack kind of groups, global groups that are using this strategy and way of doing things to push and nudge systems further. And then, of course, from the design thinking lens and human-centered design lens that very much feeds into Build Up's process, feeds into Build Up's Peace Innovative Fellowship. And like Elena was saying, one of the reasons we haven't necessarily gotten to experiments yet is that originally the idea was for Bertha centers to sort of hand over the cohorts, introduce, and for those experiments to become prototypes through the guidance of the Build Up Peace Innovator program. So I hope that helps to sort of give a little bit more, I don't know, context structure. I wish you were all here in the room with me, and I'd be up on a, yeah, definitely some need some more physical stimulus. Anyways, so that's that. But I'm going to circle back again to what's just been mentioned from Robin, Mandy, and Kanisa regarding these leverage points, these mechanisms. We're speaking about donor partnerships, the line of inquiry being, all right, so what's changed or what's possible to change in terms of the relationships that social justice or peace-building organizations have with funders, with funding networks, with philanthropy organizations, and donor partners. And this, as Mandy pointed out, this sort of retrofitting the reporting. And something that again, I'm kind of quoting somebody else in the cohort, Eleanor. She sort of the way she framed it the other week was putting a human face or a beneficiary-centered approach to reporting, and figuring out how we might be able to play experiments, tests of that that way of thinking, that way of experimenting with reporting to donor partners. So the idea is now that we're going to get feedback from some of our existing donor partners in the extended network of the 8 persons on this cohort, engaging that conversation, bringing them into that conversation around what might a beneficiary-centered reporting process look like, and how does that fundamentally change the relationship between the funder and the implementer. So that's one sort of query that we're stepping down, and in a way we're, as I think Robin or maybe it was Kanisa mentioned, in a way we're also sort of reining ourselves back. So we're like, okay, well, we can't jump down this particular rabbit hole until we've heard from more voices from the donor side of the system, from the philanthropy side of the system. And so the next session that we'll be having, likely next week, depending on availabilities, will be about exactly that. How can we engage philanthropy and donor partners as collaborators rather than confronting them with an issue or a challenge? And that comes back to the social lab perspective of bringing numerous different parts of a sector into the same space, rather than we're trying to change. We're trying to change. We're trying to confront and adjust and say this needs to be different, which can often lead to a combative or a further discord and further misunderstanding.
Fergus, do you have a plan about where we're going, or am I allowed to interject at this point and derail you somewhat?
Yes. So, well, before you interject, if you don't mind, I'd like to just get one more voice from one of the cohort members on what I've just spoken to around the experimentation going forward. And if I can just call on, say, Robin, if you could just quickly speak to that, Elena, before you jump in, just sort of one, like if you can imagine a practical example of what that might mean in the coming weeks in terms of experiments with as the Tshwane Leadership Foundation, your donor partnership networks. I hope that's okay, Elena. Yeah.
Sure. I think in my work, I always think there's no amount of good hard work that can substitute relationships and collaboration. And I would like to build on to that if it comes to looking into not interventions, but exploring those new opportunities, those new possibilities of a lesser power dynamic when it comes to donors. I think it won't be a short-term quick fix. Of course, it will be a long-term reintroducing, almost reshuffling the deck kind of process.
And are you as the Tshwane Leadership Foundation, which is a foundation that's been in action across a vast variety of social justice issues and urban space issues, can you imagine a scenario where in the coming weeks, your leadership team is able to engage with some representatives from your maybe longer standing donor partners around this kind of question?
I think in a way this process has already started. Like I mentioned, the unbecoming process that we all went through with this pandemic highlighted the role of the NGO sector in a very unusual way, I think, where it's not just a thing of we need you because of what you can give, but also of what we can contribute to the larger good. Yeah.
Thank you. And Elena, if I can invite you to jump in and keep the flow.
I mean, I want to keep the flow. You know, I think when Fergus said that I was or when we said at the beginning we were co-conspirators, what he didn't tell you is that one of my co-conspiratorial strategies is to derail Fergus somewhat. But I think in a creative way. And I just, you know, I think in the conversation, in the prompt that you just gave, and in the conversation that you were having around donor reporting, which I think is so critical to a lot of the change that we're trying to make. You know, the other thing that you all talked about was the need to use the opportunity of the pandemic to shift norms. And when you were talking about shifting norms, you were talking about the need to change language, right? And so it really strikes me that despite all of your awareness and our awareness about that, it's almost inescapable to use the word beneficiaries, that we somehow can't seem to let that one go, you know. And I think this is actually, it makes a really interesting link to the innovation process that we do at Build Up. If you'll just bear with me for a second, it's a bit of a long thread, but it'll come back to the conversation that you were just having, because one of the things that we did very early on in the peace innovation process was we said both to the donors who were funding those programs and to the people that we were working with on the innovations, let's never talk about beneficiaries. Let's drop that language, and let's substitute it with the language that comes from human-centered design. So let's substitute it with the word users. And for a while, I think that carried us through to a transformation of the way that interventions were being designed, right? It is very different to think of people as users. And it was really interesting because in the innovation processes that we were doing, people were like, this is key. Like the fact that you encourage us to think of the people that we're trying to influence as users has changed the way that we're designing all of the work that we're doing. But soon enough, I think that word became quite loaded as well. It's also quite problematic to think of people as users, right? I mean, it comes with a whole host of other kind of power dynamic problems, essentially. So then we sort of got into a tangle, and now I think we sort of, a lot of our materials say things like, I just wrote it down, so say things like people who do stuff that needs to be done, which is of course not that's not, we can't use that as an encapsulation. But one of the reasons that we got to this, like people who do the stuff that needs to be done, is that in our peace innovation process, we've now undergone this internal transformation where we've taken the human-centered design methodology that we use, and we've kind of blended it with the nonviolent communication and action process that we also use when we think about social cohesion and peace building work. And one of the things that makes clear is that transformation, any social cohesion work is the work of transformation, right? And any work that is the work of transformation has to be kind of this circular thing where whoever the initiator is, and maybe initiators is not a bad word, by the way, but whoever the initiator of the work is trying to influence a set of people whose behaviors and attitudes they think need to be changed. But then the people who are being influenced also become influencers of the initiator, right? So it's kind of this, if you want to be in the space of nonviolent communication and action, you have to be in the space of allowing your beneficiaries to actually end up benefiting you. right? If you want. And so anyway, I just think that's the link back to reporting is that if you're in that frame, then the concept of reporting on the impact that you are having on beneficiaries to a donor who's giving you money suddenly just doesn't make any sense, because aren't the donors in this in order to change and transform things? And doesn't that also mean that they're going to be changed and transformed? And then what is reporting about anyway? So not that I have an alternative exactly, but I just wanted to share that journey that we've been through, because I found your constant challenge of norms and language so powerful, and then this focus on reporting so interesting. And I still think there's this nugget about who are we talking about, right? That we should unpack a bit further.
I just quickly want to mention at 20 Leadership Foundation, we refer to beneficiaries, or even as the social workers maybe would say clients, we call them community members. So when we write that in a proposal, it also opened us up a great way to explain more about what you're saying about community, because we are community rooted and we kind of operate that way. So immediately that opens a little bit of a window.
It's something that just dawned on me is how the moment you come to social developments and all those, what the greater world always like puts into a box of like the soft, and then you look into hardcore business, then suddenly there's a shift in language. But you know, speaking about the beneficiaries also as consumers, and you know, like Helena said, like it changes how you design things, because you know it's a standard known thing that in the retail space, it's your consumers now in marketing, whatever it is, 5.0 that's come up, that feed back what they're looking for, what they're needing. But at the same time, Helena, like you're saying, but it's a complex adaptive system. So it would require adaptations on multiple levels from many different stakeholders. And Mapumba has asked a question about, you know, where do you start? Who's part of the conversation? And do you start with everybody from the beginning? And like, sure, there's the initiator that Helena spoke about, but then people kind of convert in that process to become influencers, feeding back into that complex adaptive system. And I would say, like, you would have an initiator, of course, but as quickly as you can, get your full stakeholder group together in that process, in that journey, so that it doesn't end up being one-sided. Even if the one-sided becomes from the beneficiary, or also now known like as the user, up to the donor, and then you're like, yeah, we've succeeded, we've changed the system, but you've actually just flipped it around. And so yeah, that was just something interesting that came up while you guys were talking that I thought I'd share.
Yeah, thank you, Mandy. And I'd also like to continue with Mapumba's question, in this question of who and who's participating. So the question is, how do you see the creative community, creative industries participating in the processes that we've been talking about? Do you see them as being part of the process from the beginning? And that's an important second part of the question, because Mapumba, if I hear your question well, if I interpret you well, recognizing that the second part indicates that often in these kinds of processes, and when I say these kind of processes, I mean more broadly, development work, social process, dealing with intractable complex issues. Often, if and when the creative community or industries are invited to join that process, it often isn't from the beginning, and it's often to use. There might be better ways of expressing this, but more of an aftertaste or a window dressing or a bell and a whistle, rather than an integral part. The arts and the creative industries as being an integral part of social process and reimagining possibilities, especially in terms of social issues that are complex beyond the rational and the analytical faculties to reimagine possibilities, to sort of reference Sanjay's point in the chat around participation is the action of all being in relation. So, you know, how to create participation, how to engender participation, how to encourage participation and relationship across different identities, across different boundaries, borderlands of nationality, ethnicity, religious experience, and all urban rural divides, what have you. And the arts, the creative industries, I feel, in my opinion, has everything to do with this process and from the beginning. And it's the question is actually at the heart of my own personal research interest, which is the relationship between processes of celebration, cultural events, cultural celebrations, and social transformations. And what are the so a lot of my research in the back end here is how festivals in particular and the arts are fundamentally playing a role in reimagining narratives, in reconfiguring relationships across and internal to communities, and are creating an opportunity for the performance, the embodiment of an envisioned future. There's that Alice Walker quote that goes, to paraphrase it, it's a question. Does your present resemble resemble the future you are dreaming of? And so in performance, in storytelling, in a liminal space of a festival, it's often the most incredible opportunity to imagine and embody the kinds of futures that we're dreaming into, that go beyond our critical and analytical faculties. And so that question, I'm sorry, is sort of a little bit of a favorite for me in that sense. And it's something that I'd very much like to explore in the context of these kinds of processes going forward. And I'd like to hand over and invite Robin to share a little bit about her experience in relation to that question of the creative industries as it pertains to these kinds of processes and other social justice work. Because of course, Robin and the Swane Leadership Foundation has been busy at this for a long time.
Thank you, Fergus. Part of my responsibilities is with my team is organizing the Feast of the Clowns, which is it started as in 2000 as a very small street festival, but now has become a large kind of a protest. We call it the colorful, peaceful protest of clowns, which focus is really social justice issues, bringing awareness to people who might not even, people from in the inner city and on the outskirts of the city, who might not have access to other platforms, who might not be digital, who might not attend churches and all of those things, and also access to the arts. We see the arts as that universal language that Fergus was speaking about. So because we also work with the people who have experienced a lot of trauma, who has a lot of limitations to language, or for instance, refugees, so forth, it's this one element that we found that can bring everything and everyone together and translate a lot of other elements. So a lot of our work goes into that, and then also creating platforms for creative expression. So within all our workshops and so forth, there will always be an element of that. Whereas, I mean, all of us has that different, some of us are more linguistic, some of us are more something else. But yeah, creative expression is really been like the golden thread for us.
So Mapumba, in a follow-up question, how to communicate that role by artists in the process would be great. Also, if we have something to say on that. Well, I don't have much to say on that other than just as Robin, myself, Mandy, Konisa, Leander, Hillary, how we and many others are participating in a system justice lab as a pilot of the process in the way that we've described. That's what I mean. So the participation in this process would be just as we are participating in it now, not as an auxiliary, but really part and parcel of this learning journey. So one way of imagining it is at this stage of, Chris was asking earlier, where are we into, are we still at the scanning stage? Yes, we're at the scanning stage. And in a way, so what I mean is artists and people and persons in the creative industries being a part of this process from inception. That's what I mean by participation, and being in relation to where this goes, and also helping to imagine and reflexively build where this goes, and how we continue to frame this. So I imagine us doing a process similar to this at a larger scale, or slightly adapted after this pilot. And I imagine you being a incredible accomplice in asking these questions further around how this relates to the creative industries in Cape Town and more broadly. And just so Mapumba, I hope that answers your question. I'm just going to also, while I'm at it, just pop the Feast of the Clowns link in here, which is an exquisite example of bringing the creative industries and performance to bear on the really deep, gritty work that Robin and the team at TLF is really leading the way. TLF work across everything from housing to mental health issues, to homelessness, to local enterprise and building networks between local ground up crafts and enterprise. It's across the board, and it's deep and it's gritty and it's interconnected at the heart of Pretoria. And every year they come together and they harness this creative network that they've built, that they've grown over the years, to explore and deepen and connect and create greater relationship, and a feast, a moment of reprise and sort of relief, if you will, of some of the difficulty that some of this work implies. But keeping an eye on the time, I want us to start circling back to a bit of a wrap up. And by way of doing so, I'm first going to ask accomplice in not crime, accomplice in good deeds, Elena, if there are any additional sort of signals that you're hearing that we may want to keep in mind as we start to close, and or threads that we may have not tied up. Yeah.
I don't think this is additional. I think I was keeping a little notebook as different interventions happened, and in the middle of it, in block capitals, I wrote norms, double underlined, and I just think, I'm still figuring this out. I think it's really, I think when we talk about systems and how to transform systems, at least I have a tendency to very quickly get very almost operational, like to think, okay, what are the leverage points and what are the experiments we can do to try and shift these leverage points, and etc. And somehow I'm always thinking about like operational systems as opposed to normative systems. And I just, I found the fact that you all talked about norms in different ways throughout this panel really interesting, and a, definitely a challenge for me in how we think about work moving forward. And so I think what I'm really curious about where this process goes next is, how do we, as we begin to look into leverage points and what kind of work can be done on these leverage points, how do we make sure that we remain somewhat centered on this idea of transforming norms? and of not, the other thing that really stood out to me was this idea that you can't, I think it was Kanisa, I think you said, or I may be misremembering that, but somebody said that we can't recreate institutions with the same language that they were destroyed with. I don't think we can recreate systems with the same language that they were constructed with. So anyway, those are my takeaways. Fergus, I know you're going to ask others for reflections. I also want to ask that before you close, you say what happens next and how people can follow.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'll do that before the close. Yeah, thank you. Well, first off, in terms of what next, I would be remiss if I did not invite you and encourage you to register, put a reminder, and join in on the main stage to experience and participate in the experience of Mapumba's performance. Brother M is the name of the performance, or his performance and stage name, and Mapumba will be online and live, direct from the Hive here in Cape Town at 9 o'clock South African time. So first and foremost, just encouraging you all to sign into that and be there for the full experience and participate. And then in terms of what next for this process, first off, thank you for your engagement and for your questions and participation in this discussion. And I will be putting up an announcement later on today on the announcements page, once I have a moment, about an unconference session that I'll be plugging into the. I'll just follow the same process and put an unconference breakout session up, and then also please reach out to me directly if you'd like, connect directly, and we can make a quick time to call or to chat over the course of the next 2 days, where I might have a gap in between moderation and other logistics, and we can discuss further if for instance you aren't able to attend that unconference session. And with the announcement, I'll be adding a couple of additional links and some information for those who weren't here during the panel. So yeah, and just to be clear, what I envision us doing in that unconference session is quite practically running through a systems mapping exercise, imperfectly, imprecisely, but just giving it some rough shape, and hopefully being able to wrap up with a engaged discussion around how this connects with your work and in what way you might be interested going forward. So that's the next steps, and then I'll hand over to everybody else for a quick check out and any closing remarks, comments, invitations to the listeners. And I'd like to ask Kanisa to kick us off and then just pass the baton. And we are closing in on overtime now, so I guess let's move swiftly.
Sure. I just want to say thank you, guys. It's been a great co-learning experience. I'm leaving inspired, actually. It sounds different when you're talking about what you do and like incorporating it with what other people are doing and thinking. So it's been really rich, and all the best with the rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah. I also feel really enriched being able to sit at this table, and I'm excited to see what are the building blocks that that can close the gaps between this polarization that happened between donors and implementers. I'm really excited to see that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's great to have some interaction, some Q&A, some discussion with these amazing people again. So great. Any time we have to talk more is always enlightening. So we scored on many fronts. We got to talk to the audience, but we also got to talk to each other.
So from my side, yeah, thanks all. really, yeah, just feeling more energized than I did when I started, and I was feeling really energized when I started. So I'm good. Thank you all for your participation, and I'm looking forward to this conversation, this discussion, this topic continuing tomorrow, and that fills me with a lot of with a lot of encouragement. So looking forward to that. And Mandy, Kanisa, Robin, thank you so much. Especially just for the nature of helping to also co-create this over the past few weeks and further back. It's been really tricky to figure out how to do something that we really wanted to do together and move together and have these sessions in person, but to be able to have these kind of illuminating and animated discussions, even though we're all virtual, has been really testament to everybody's attention and intention. So thank you so much. Thank you to you guys, and thank you so much to Elena for accomplice. Thanks. And so over to you, Elena, if you'd like to add any other final thoughts in the next minute.
I just wanted to encourage everybody who's in the audience to take a screen break now, if you can. I know, I'm grateful we can do a virtual conference. I also know it's a lot of screen time for everybody, but do come back to the main stage if you have the time. In about 30 minutes, we have a set of short talks on digital conflict drivers, reconciliation, and identity, which I think are going to be really fascinating. And then, of course, more on the program that you'll see if you go to Agenda. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you at the next session.